If you struggle with negative self-talk, worry, rumination, self-criticism, I am going to share with you 3 of my very favorite tips, not just for getting relief from negative self-talk, but to help you avoid those negative self-talk spirals in the first place. All right, a reader asks, I really struggle with negative self-talk. I seem to fall into these spirals of ruminating on what I did wrong and then criticizing myself for it. I know it's not good for me, but I just can't seem to pull out once it starts. A lot of the advice I hear about negative self-talk, it's not great because ultimately it focuses on immediate relief in the moment instead of addressing the root cause of the self-talk. So these are my favorite tips for not just addressing self-talk superficially, but for really getting at it from the root level. Number 1, distinguish negative thoughts from negative thinking. Now, you might say negative thoughts versus negative thinking, what's the big deal, right? Sounds like the same thing. They sound the same, but they're actually remarkably different in some very important ways. Negative thoughts, these pop into our heads all the time, and there is nothing we can or should do to try and control them. Your brain just throws them at you, okay? And you can't do anything about that. Negative thinking, on the other hand, is the mental habit of elaborating on our negative thoughts. And it is something we absolutely do have control over. It's a mental habit. It's a behavior. It's a mental behavior. And taking control of that behavior, of elaborating on our negative thoughts, that, it turns out, is the secret to getting at the root of struggles with negative self-talk. An analogy I like to give here is if you think about 2 different musical instruments, think about a tuba and a violin. Now, yes, technically they are both musical instruments, but they are remarkably different things. If you want to play the tuba well, it's an entirely different skill set than learning how to play the violin well. They look really different. They weigh completely different amounts. So they're really very, very separate things, even though superficially you might think, oh, they're both just musical instruments. That's a little bit like this distinction between negative thoughts and negative thinking. Superficially, they seem really similar, but in reality, they are worlds apart, and learning to distinguish them and treat them differently is the key. That's at the heart of getting better at dealing with negative self-talk. So ultimately, the first step is you need to get clarity about this distinction, about what you do and don't have control over when it comes to negative self-talk. Because here's what I see over and over and over again with folks, my coaching clients who really struggle with negative self-talk is they put all of their time and energy into trying to not have negative thoughts in the first place. But all that energy, not only does it not do anything, but that's all time and energy that they don't have to put toward controlling the thing they actually do have control over, and that's causing most of the problems, which is negative thinking. All the elaborating on the initial negative thought that they do after the fact. So just to make this a little bit real, you might have, let's say a worry pops into your head. Let's say your oldest child is leaving for college, and you have this worry that pops into your head of they're not going to make any friends at school. Then you start worrying about, oh my God, they're going to get really depressed. And what if they start using drugs? What if they have to drop out of school? They come back and live with me. They're never going to get a job. They're going to be super unhappy and miserable, yada, 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 yada. All of that is negative thinking. And while it feels like it just happened to you, that is something you can and should absolutely try to control. Just because that initial negative thought, what if my son never makes friends at college? Just because that initial negative thought pops in doesn't mean you have to continue this pattern of negative thinking, this negative self-talk conversation. Okay, so it's not something that happens to you. It's actually something that you do. You initiate. And however habitual or automatic it feels, it's really important that you get absolutely clear with yourself that that is something with practice you can get better at controlling and not doing. So a little mantra for this that I like that I think is really helpful is just because your mind talks doesn't mean you have to talk back. So just because your mind throws a negative thought at you, that doesn't mean you have to get into a conversation with that negative thought in the form of negative thinking, all this elaborative negative self-talk. Okay, so try to keep that distinction in mind. Negative thoughts, negative thinking. Just because you have a negative thought doesn't mean you have to fall into negative thinking. All right, so that's the first one. Number 2 is validate the emotions behind negative self-talk. Now, like our reader today, if you struggle with negative self-talk, there's probably a good amount of frustration in there. Like, why do I keep doing this to myself? I know that all this negative self-talk, it's not good for me. When I fall into spirals of worry, I just end up feeling way more anxious. When I fall into spirals of self-criticism, I just feel way more depressed and ashamed of myself. When I fall into spirals of rumination about how someone's hurt me, I just end up feeling really angry and bitter and resentful. It's not doing me any good. So why do we do it? Why do we fall into these spirals of negative thinking, this negative self-talk? The answer that I think is kind of underrated, I think a lot of people don't realize what's going on. I'm not saying it's the only answer, but it's a really important one, and it happens way more often than you would think. So there's a very good chance, if you struggle, especially with chronic negative self-talk, there's a very good chance this is the root cause of why you keep doing this to yourself, even though you know it's unhelpful. And that is negative thinking, this kind of persistent negative self-talk. It's a defense mechanism. Now, what does that mean? Fancy psychological jargon. A defense mechanism just means you feel hurt, and so you do something to feel less pain. Coping strategy would be another way to think about this. Often, negative thinking, whether it's worrying about the future or ruminating on something in the past or criticizing yourself for a mistake or a misstep, like whatever the form of negative self-talk, it often serves the function of distracting us very briefly from a painful emotion in the present. So go back to our example of the parent who starts worrying about their son going away to college and never having any friends, right? If you do that, if you have this initial negative thought that pops into your head, it is inevitably going to produce a little bit of anxiety. That's totally normal. You can't do anything about it. There's no way to get out of feeling a little bit of anxiety because your brain threw a worry at you. The trouble is, most of us are so intolerant of difficult emotions like anxiety or sadness that we immediately feel like, I have to do something about this. I can't just feel anxious. I have to do something not to feel anxious anymore. And for a lot of us, what we do is we go into our head. We start problem solving in response to feeling bad emotionally. And if you think about this, it's not that surprising, right? We spend the first 20 plus years of our lives in school largely being trained to problem solve everything. Like, that's the answer. Be a good problem solver. So it isn't any surprise that when we're confronted with a difficulty like feeling bad, we interpret that as a problem and then use this particular skill set that we have arguably overlearned, which is apply analytical thinking and problem solving. And that's essentially what worry is. It's unhelpful thinking about something scary or dangerous in the future. So when we feel anxious, why do we start worrying? Even though we know long-term, that's just going to lead to a lot more anxiety. We do it because very temporarily, it gets us out of our body, which is uncomfortable when we're anxious, and up into our head. So we slightly avoid the anxiety. We put a little distance between ourselves and the feeling by going intellectual, by doing this worrying or intellectual activity, right? And again, like we said, even though this leads to a lot of painful emotion later, the amount of overall anxiety you feel after worrying is way bigger than that initial burst of anxiety that came from that one negative thought that popped in your head. Still, it allows us to get out of that initial anxiety. And I think you can probably think of a lot of things in your life where even though it hurts you long term, you do it in the moment because it feels good, essentially. Like, why do we eat junk food? We all know it's bad for us, but we do it because it feels really good in the moment, even though we know long term it's not good for us. So this same dynamic happens emotionally in our psychological lives. So if you want to break the habit of negative self-talk, you need a better way to deal with those difficult emotions, because so often this habit of negative self-talk, and again, it could be worry, it could be self-criticism, it could be rumination, really any form of overthinking often takes the form of unhelpful negative self-talk. So much of the time, the reason that exists, the reason that habit exists, is because it's a way for us to deal with difficult emotion. But if we can find a better way to deal with our difficult emotions, we can let that habit go. We can essentially put it out of a job. If we find a better, healthier way to deal with difficult emotions in the moment, we won't need negative self-talk as a tool, as a function to help us cope with or defend against those difficult emotions. So, what else do you do in the presence of difficult emotion? The answer is validation. Now, validation, you may have heard of this term. It's one of these annoying therapist terms that everyone talks about, but no one actually explains. So I'm going to explain to you what a validation is and why it's so helpful for negative self-talk specifically. Validation is very simple. All it means is, it's reminding yourself that feeling bad doesn't necessarily mean something is bad, including yourself. So, some examples of validation. You're feeling anxious, and you might say to yourself, you know what? Okay, I'm anxious. I don't like feeling anxious, but it's not surprising that I'm feeling anxious given that comment someone just made to me. So it's not surprising is a nice way to do validation. Another one is it makes sense. So I'm feeling really sad right now. I hate feeling sad. I really don't want to feel this way. I don't think I should be feeling this sad for this long, but actually, I just had a huge loss in my life, and it makes sense that I would continue to feel sad about it. Right? So you're saying it makes sense. Even if you don't like it, on some level, it makes sense that you're feeling the way you're feeling. Another really powerful one actually is other people would feel this way too. So for instance, I'm feeling really angry at so-and-so for what they did. I don't like feeling angry. I want to let go of this anger. But you know what? A lot of people in my shoes, if they were in my shoes, they would feel angry too. This one's nice because it helps us to not feel alone in our difficult emotions, which turns out is one of the biggest reasons it's hard to get out of difficult emotions, is because we feel lonely with them. But this little technique, other people would feel this way too. It reminds us that we're not alone. So all of these are just examples of little bits of constructive self-talk that you can use to address those difficult emotions in a healthy way, and therefore not need the negative self-talk as a solution, as a defense mechanism, as a coping mechanism. Another way you can think about validation is it's something you already do. Just like if someone came to you and they said, I'm really scared about this situation I have coming up. You probably wouldn't say, oh, you dummy, you don't need to be scared about that. Like, that's so stupid. Why are you feeling scared? No, you wouldn't criticize someone for feeling anxious, right? What you would probably say, you'd just be supportive. You'd say, gosh, I'm really sorry to hear that. That's tough. Like, I've felt anxious about situations like that before, and it's rough, but it's really understandable that you're feeling that way, right? So we validate other people all the time. It's a skill you already have. The trick is just to remember to apply that to yourself. And when you get better at doing this, at validating your own difficult emotions, you no longer need negative self-talk as a way to cope with them. Okay, so those are really the two big things you need to know if you want to get at the root cause of negative self-talk. You have to distinguish negative thoughts, which you can't control, from negative thinking, which you absolutely can control. It's a mental habit. And then you want to get good at validating the emotion behind negative self-talk. Whatever negative self-talk is in response to, validate it. And eventually, as you get better at that, you won't need the negative self-talk so much, and it will sort of fall away on its own. At this point, though, something I usually hear from people is, okay, I get that. That makes sense. But it's still really hard. When I find myself in a storm of negative self-talk, I know what I should do, but it feels too hard to pull out, right? So this is where my third tip on this is, do your negative thinking on paper, not in your head. Do your negative thinking on paper, not in your head. Now, this probably sounds like strange advice, but the trick is, you're right, it is hard. You've built up this habit of responding to difficult emotions, initial difficult emotions, with lots of negative self-talk. It's not just going to go away just because you learned some interesting things on Nick's video series. It's going to go away as you get better at and develop confidence letting go of difficult self-talk and applying validation. But that takes some time, right? So one way you can speed up your kind of confidence building in letting go of negative self-talk is this exercise I call scheduled worry. Now, scheduled worry, it's called scheduled worry because it was used and created mostly for dealing with chronic worry, but it actually applies super well to any kind of negative self-talk, self-criticism, rumination, and worry, okay? The thing you want to do with scheduled worry is you make a little bit of time every day to do your negative thinking on paper. So you carve out 10 minutes from, like when I do this, I do it from, like 7:45 to 8 p.m. after I've put the kids to bed, but before my wife and I, watch a show or read or something. And I just sit down, and all you do is you pick up just like a notepad, right? Scrap of paper, doesn't have to be anything fancy. And you just start writing off everything, every bit of negative self-talk you can think of, right? Everything you're worried about, every bit of like rumination, every mistake you made, just put it down, how you're feeling about it, how you're thinking about it. Every bit of self-criticism, right? Just get it all down onto paper. Don't try to solve it or analyze it or anything like that. You're just kind of like transferring it from your head onto paper. And you do this every day for about 10 minutes. You set an alarm. After your 10 minutes is up though, you get rid of the paper. Don't keep it, don't analyze it, just toss it away. The content is not what's important. What's important is that you do it consistently because, and this is the key, the reason this exercise works, if you do this, it changes your relationship with negative self-talk. By deliberately approaching negative self-talk and doing it on purpose, what you're teaching your brain is you're not afraid of it and all the emotions that go with it. It's something you do. Instead of negative self-talk being this thing that happens to you, which is how it normally feels, when you initiate it, you build a sense of agency and confidence over your own mind. This negative self-talk, it is something I can choose to do or eventually not do by deliberately initiating it. So that's the magic of scheduled worry and making a time to consistently write out and do your negative thinking on paper. It builds inner agency over your self-talk. And the more you do this, the stronger you will get and the easier you will find it to sort of let go of negative self-talk in the moment. Okay? So it builds confidence and agency. That's why it works. Okay, so if you hear this technique, scheduled worry, writing out your negative thinking on paper, not in your head, and you're like, okay, that sounds good, but like, how do I actually do it? It's not actually that hard. Don't overthink it. But if you want a little bit more guidance, I put together a free, like 4 or 5 page PDF guide where I walk through step by step how to do scheduled worry and how you can apply it. It answers some common questions and gives you some other little resources about it. So if you're interested, check that out. I will put a link in the notes to this video below, and you can find that for free. Lastly, if you enjoyed this video, I have another video that I think you'll really like. It's called 2 Hidden Causes of Chronic Worry. So if you really struggle with chronic worry in particular, I think you're really going to find this video helpful, and you can find it right here.